Newton's laws of motion tell us that when I drop this ball and this dollar bill at the same time, they should fall at the same rate. But you know they won't. That's because the laws of motion hold true in a vacuum where there's no air resistance. Newton realized that his laws of motion apply only to the extent that certain assumptions are valid. When I hit this billiard ball, it seems to move in a straight line. So the laws of motion seem to hold a bit better. But if we looked closer, we'd find the ball really moves in a slightly curved path because of the Earth's rotation. What we've discovered is that Newton's laws can predict the behavior of matter to various degrees. How good the predictions are depends on the extent that reality comes close to the Newtonian reference system. When the assumptions aren't true, the predictions don't hold, like with the dollar bill. And when the assumptions are correct, the laws of motion seem to work, like with the pool ball. In economics, the model of perfect competition is the usual reference system. Perfect competition is an idealization that we'll never experience in reality. There is simply no economic system with perfect information, frictionless entry and exit, and a complete absence of market power. But the model of perfect competition helps us understand and predict behavior where markets come close to the competitive ideal. And importantly, the model defines economic welfare and efficiency. It gives us a yardstick to allow us to evaluate non-competitive outcomes. In our course so far, we've modeled the interaction of buyers and sellers in both output and input markets. The demand curve in the output market showed us how consumers made optimal decisions, choosing what to buy in ways that maximize their utility. The supply curve in the product market reflected the optimal decisions of firms. It showed us the amount that firms would be willing to produce to maximize profits. In fact, the supply curve mirrored firms' marginal cost curves. In the input or resource market, households maximized utility by balancing labor-leisure decisions, and that determined the supply of labor. Firms' demands for inputs were again a result of profit-maximizing strategies, where decision-makers balanced marginal resource costs with marginal revenue products. All along, we've assumed that perfectly competitive markets existed both on the input and the output side. We assumed that no individual economic agents were large enough to influence the price, so both firms and households were price takers. We also made sure that both households and firms had perfect information. Consumers knew everything about product quality and could compare all prices. Firms had perfect information about technology and production, and it was easy to enter or exit industries in search of profits. If all these assumptions hold true, then the economic system will efficiently allocate resources. Now, what does that mean? Efficient production means that resources are being used to make things that people want in the least costly way. There are two aspects of efficiency: things being made that people want, and they're being made in an economical fashion. If production weren't efficient, there would be better ways of using scarce resources. So what do we mean by better? Well, if we engage in trade, I get something I want, and you get something you want. Presumably, we're both better off. Now, what if we both traded until there was no possible change that could make us both better off? In other words, any trade would necessarily mean that one of us was worse off than before the trade. An efficient economic system results in a situation that achieves this sort of optimality. The model of perfect competition is so powerful because economists generally believe that perfect competition results in that sort of outcome. That sort of outcome is called Pareto optimal. Pareto optimal. Pareto optimal? Pareto optimal? Since this is so important, let's explore efficiency in some detail. We'll begin by reviewing the three fundamental questions that societies address. What does an economy produce? how are resources used in production, and finally, how is output distributed in society? In a competitive economy, these questions are answered in a decentralized way. Individuals pursue their wants and desires without interference. People go into business and produce things that other people want to buy. Others decide whether to acquire skills or not, to work or not, and whether to buy, invest, or save the money they earn. In terms of efficiency, the ideal of perfect competition means that what an economy does produce are the things that people want, and the resources are allocated efficiently, and that output is also efficiently distributed. Now, there are three fundamental conditions that must hold if an economic outcome is efficient, what we call Pareto optimal. The first is that the marginal benefit must equal the marginal cost. If marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost, then too little is being produced. And if the marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost, then too much is being produced. Let's say that for some good, the marginal benefit was greater than the marginal cost of production. If this is the case, then we know that people value the good more than it costs to produce it. That means there's a free ride possible, so we can't be in a situation of efficiency, and society would come out ahead if more of that good were produced. The second condition is that the marginal cost of a good should be equal for every producer. Now, if that weren't the case, then output could increase without cost, which is clearly inefficient. For example, if Frank could produce an extra pizza for $20 and Alice could produce one for $5, then it makes sense for Alice to produce more and Frank less. Frank could take the $20 he saved by not producing and buy the pizza from Alice with money left over. Only when marginal costs are equal across firms can these sorts of trades not take place. Finally, we want to assure that the allocation of output to different consumers is efficient. The requirement is this, that the marginal benefit of consumption should be equal for every consumer. This rule is just like the previous one for firms. If Jennifer's marginal benefit of chocolate, for example, was $5 and Ken's was $1, then Ken could sell roses to Jennifer for $3 and they'd both be better off. Only if marginal benefits are the same would we have no improvement by trade.
It's time once again for Smart Guy, Dumb Guy.
McMurr, McMurr, McMurr.
What are you doing with a hamburger?
Hey man, I'm memorizing the deal for how much firms should make.
McMurr?
Yeah, here.
No. You mean MC equals MR. That's marginal cost equals marginal revenue.
Right.
Okay. Well, let's see you figure it out on a graph, all right? Okay, I'll draw one.
Got it. See, the firm produces right where MC equals MR. McMurr.
All right, now show me the profit for the firm.
What?
The profit. Use the diagram and sketch in the profit or loss.
Oh, I can't do that.
Sure you can. Here, look. Look, you know the correct output. Okay, it's here where the marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Now take a look at the average total cost curve. That's the ATC.
Yeah.
Well, see? Look, if you make the rectangle here, the area represents total cost, ATC times quantity. And it's easy to get the total revenue, too.
What?
Yeah. Look, for this firm, marginal revenue equals average revenue.
Okay, yeah, I know that one. That's the deal with perfectly competitive firms.
Right.
Totally laid back curves.
Yeah, okay. Now, sketch the rectangle here, okay? Average revenue times quantity, and the area is the total revenue.
Cool.
Yeah, now, the difference is profit. See?
Yeah, but profit should be zero in perfect competition, but like here, it's not.
Good point. So what's wrong?
You screwed up the graph.
No, look, what we've got here is price, okay? Okay. This is the marginal revenue, okay? That's too high. So the firms will enter this industry and drive the price down. All right, see, okay, here's the industry curves, and the supply shifts out, and the equilibrium drops.
To here.
Perfect.
Perfect competition, man. It rules.
You gonna eat that?
Yeah. You want some?
Informally, we can show these results hold. Let's take the first one. The fact that in perfect competition, the price of a good is equal to the marginal cost of production assures that the mix of output is efficient. Marginal benefit is willingness to pay, and individuals choose quantities of goods such that price equals marginal benefit. On the other side, producers choose levels of output such that price equals marginal cost. So under perfect competition, we know that marginal benefit equals marginal cost. So our first requirement is satisfied. The second and third requirements are met because under perfect competition, households and firms are price takers. That means marginal benefits are the same for all consumers, and marginal costs are the same for all producers. Everyone faces the same prices, which equate to marginal benefits on the consumption side and to marginal costs on the production side. We know that in a competitive market, then, marginal benefits equal the marginal costs are equal for every producer, and marginal benefits are equal for every consumer. So, competitive markets are Pareto optimal.
And now it's time for Chalk Talk with your host, Miss Sarah.
Now we're going to look at producer surplus and consumer surplus. If we take our standard supply and demand curve, and this is our equilibrium price and quantity, all these consumers and producers benefit from being in this market. For example, this consumer right here was willing to pay this much for the good, but he only had to pay this price down here. So he benefited, he got consumer surplus. As it turns out, this entire area here represents consumer surplus. The difference between the amount they were willing to pay and the amount they actually had to pay. Likewise, there's also producer surplus. The producer was willing to supply a good at, say, this price, but they actually got this price for it. So they would receive surplus as well. And producer surplus looks like this. They were willing to supply it at this price down here. They received a price much higher than that, so they received surplus for it. We can use consumer and producer surplus to look at the gains to producer surplus and the loss to consumer surplus that happens in a monopoly. Now, as you remember, a monopolist will decide to produce at the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's the quantity for the monopoly. The price they will charge is where we go up to the demand curve and over. That's the price for a monopoly. Now, under perfect competition, they would produce here, where marginal cost equals price. So that's the quantity for perfectly competitive, and this is the price for perfectly competitive. Under perfect competition, the consumer surplus is this triangle here, and producer surplus is this triangle here. Under a monopoly, as you can see, the producers have taken over some of the consumer surplus by charging this price here, and their producer surplus is that area there, while consumer surplus is this smaller triangle here. This area here is called deadweight loss. The consumers lost it and the producers lost some of it, but nobody gained it, so it disappeared. It's called deadweight loss. And it is the loss to society that occurs because there's a monopoly. The producers gain from a monopoly, consumers lose, but society as a whole loses because the producers don't gain as much as the consumers lose.
Depending on the elasticities of demand and supply, the gains to consumers may outweigh the deadweight loss, which could motivate consumer groups to pressure politicians for regulation. Well, here's an example. In this graph, we see the market clearing price of $2 and the regulated price is $1. Area A represents a transfer of producer surplus to consumers, which far exceeds the value lost to consumers from the deadweight loss, which is Area B. Well, knowing about producer and consumer surplus can also help us understand what happens in the presence of taxation, something we'll talk about in some detail a bit later on. Well, let's begin without taxation. P sub 0 is the market equilibrium price and Q sub 0 is the equilibrium quantity. Now we'll impose a dollar unit tax. This is shown by a vertical shift of the supply curve of $1, the amount of the tax. Here, P sub C is what consumers pay and P sub S is what sellers receive. The difference is $1. Under taxation, we've moved along the demand curve, so Q sub 1 is the amount sold. The area, A, is a loss of consumer surplus, and B is a loss of producer surplus, but not a loss to society, because that area is the tax revenue. The deadweight loss of the tax is given by the sum of the areas B plus C. That's the loss to society. It's called the excess burden of taxation. The burden of taxation in this example partly falls on producers and partly on consumers. Incidence of taxation refers to the balance of the loss. If the demand curve is inelastic relative to the supply curve, tax incidence falls mainly on consumers. There's actually a formula that tells us the percentage of the tax that's borne by consumers, and that's called the pass-through fraction. The equation is this. In the numerator, we have the elasticity of supply, and in the denominator, we have the difference between the elasticity of supply and the elasticity of demand. So, when demand is totally inelastic, so that the elasticity of demand is 0, then the pass-through fraction is 1, so the complete tax falls on consumers. With demand completely elastic, the pass-through fraction is 0, and producers bear the burden of taxation.
In this class, we've examined efficiency and welfare under perfect competition. We came up with a measure of welfare using consumer and producer surplus, and we've seen what happens when competitive market is tampered with. There are other views of competition that don't rely on the concept of equilibrium and have a different picture of economics. One of the most influential is due to the famous Austrian Ludwig von Mises, who introduced the Austrian view.
Historical Moments with John Watkins, Ph.D.
The Austrian School of Economics, which includes Karl Menger, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Israeli Kirzner, among others, rejects perfect competition with its emphasis on equilibrium. Instead, the Austrians understand the market as a dynamic process initiated by the entrepreneur. Equilibrium is used as an ideal towards which the economy moves, but never arrives. In other words, the market tends towards stability without ever becoming stable. The Austrians take issue with the notion of perfect competition because it abstracts from the market process, conveying a distorted picture of how markets work. Recall that perfect competition results in a Pareto optimum, a situation in which there are no further profitable trades. No one can reallocate his resources to make himself better off without someone becoming worse off. The idea that at equilibrium trading ceases is surprising. But if there are no further opportunities for profit, why trade? Why produce? Perfect competition in a static sense can't account for the dynamic nature of the competitive process and the central role of the entrepreneur. Why, for example, under perfect competition would entrepreneurs seek to develop new products, introduce new techniques, or open new markets? The Austrians do not define competition in terms of many buyers and sellers, perfect information, homogeneous products, and free exit and entry. Instead, competition is viewed as a sequence of dovetailing decisions, each decision affecting the other in a way that moves the economy along. In brief, the competitive process is conceived as one in which the market is able to respond quickly to changes. It is the speed with which the market can adjust that defines efficiency, and this speed depends on the willingness, alertness, and ability of entrepreneurs to exploit profitable opportunities.
What is an entrepreneur? Normally, we think of an entrepreneur as a risk taker, but she or he is much more than this. An entrepreneur organizes production, opens new markets, introduces new techniques, and so on. An entrepreneur is motivated by profit. She or he recognizes profitable opportunities and acts on them. Hence, there are two components to an entrepreneur: entrepreneurial alertness and a willingness to act. The idea of entrepreneurial alertness implies that entrepreneurs see the world differently from others. They have information that others do not have, and they are willing to act on that information. Hence, one essential ingredient to entrepreneurship is information. Information that either others do not have or are unwilling to act on. This information raises the possibility of earning profits. But what is the nature of this information? Entrepreneurial information may be classified into two types. First, knowledge of market processes, and two, an awareness of profitable opportunities. An entrepreneur may know where to find inputs less expensive than other entrepreneurs, or she may know where to sell the output more expensively. In brief, she may be alert to profitable opportunities and willing to exploit them. As a society, what can we do to increase the level of information? Now, two different approaches have emerged to address the lack of information that results in market failures. First, in many cases, businesses have found that they can enhance their profits by providing consumers with information. Or, if that is not possible, many entrepreneurs guarantee their products. R.W. Sears, for example, was among the first to guarantee his products from defect. In effect, Sears reduced the uncertainty for consumers, while at the same time creating customer loyalty. Since Sears, many other businesses have done the same. Other businesses have developed that make money by providing consumers with information so they can make better choices. In effect, these businesses earn money by reducing the costs of market failures. Consumer Reports, for example, is a business created to provide consumers with information about products. Consumer Reports finances the research about products, writes up the information, and sells that information to consumers. It makes money because by selling that information to one consumer does not preclude it from selling that information to others. In effect, the approach taken reduces considerably the cost of obtaining information, while at the same time enabling consumers to make better choices. Second, governments may provide information. In brief, government intervenes in order to limit the choices that consumers may make, or provide consumers with knowledge to make better choices. In these cases, government intervention takes the form of education about such products. In effect, government institutions in the form of public education, driver safety classes, drug and alcohol classes, and so on, provide information so that people may make better informed choices. The Park Service, Forest Service, and the Bureau of Land Management spend a lot of time providing information to the public. For many years, agents from the Agricultural Department provided information to farmers about techniques to improve output and reduce soil erosion. And the government continues to provide information about nutritional and fat content in the foods and the products we enjoy.
Microeconomics, despite the name, there's nothing small about it. It's what's happening, and it's happening now. We've got your basic models, including both supply and demand.
Perhaps the most pervasive source of information in our society is advertising. It's pervasive because it is largely provided at no charge, subsidized by the private sector. Advertising is on one hand an effort to persuade the consumer to buy the product, and on the other hand, advertising provides information to consumers. But the information provided is always selective, an effort to cast the best possible light on the product. Cigarette advertising is an exception. Here, manufacturers are required to include in their advertising the harmful effects of cigarettes. From the point of view of Austrian economics, advertising goes hand in hand with entrepreneurship. Advertising provides consumers with information that enables them to maximize their utility. It is not an effort to manipulate consumers, but rather an effort to anticipate consumer wants. So from an Austrian point of view, the consumer reigns supreme. John Kenneth Galbraith sees things differently. He argues that advertising is an effort on part of businesses to manipulate people's preferences. So consumers are not sovereign. As an example, he points to the amount of money that firms spend on advertising. Some TV producers concede that the point of local news is to fill the space between the advertisements. In fact, the distinction between news and advertising is becoming blurred. News programs are filled with interviews of celebrities, raising the question whether such interviews are news or advertising. MTV transformed the advertising message into the viewing object. But none has been more explicit about this than the home shopping, where watching shopping on TV is passed off as entertainment. Galbraith argues that the selective and biased information provided by advertising enhances corporate profits by creating a consumer mentality. The underlying assumption reflected in microeconomics is that more is always preferred to less, and that new product or service is the key to happiness. Most people, of course, do not believe that consumption is the key to happiness, but for most of us, a variety of reasons are why we act as though we do. Galbraith continues that advertising represents a wasteful expense. If we could reduce or eliminate the costs associated with advertising, we could reduce costs. Now, the Austrians disagree. Advertising for them is inseparable from the product itself, because advertising creates an expectation about what the product will do. So the expectation that exists in people's minds is a part of the product. Our views of competitive markets rest on assumptions. Just as Newton's predictions hold to the extent that his assumptions are realistic, so do the forecasts of economists. Importantly, the competitive model, although never realized, is a standard by which we can gauge the performance of non-competitive markets. What happens, for example, when consumers don't have perfect information about product quality and reliability? Will we achieve efficient levels of production when firms not only produce goods and services, but pollution as well? When employees know more about their productivity than their employers, will they be paid according to marginal productivity? Or what changes when firms make prices instead of taking them as given? We'll discuss these topics and more in the upcoming programs. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you soon.